The ground beneath Baxter Lee's boots cracked with frost, as Shadow dropped the old metal badge at his feet, dirt-streaked and tarnished by years buried deep in Rocky Mountain snow. The badge bore the emblem of the Tuskegee Airmen, wings etched into dull silver, a ghost from a war that stole men and never returned them whole. Baxter's breath caught in his throat, visible in the December cold, because this badge belonged to his grandfather, a pilot whose plane vanished over enemy skies in 1944 and whose body never came home. Shadow pawed at the frozen earth again, whimpering low. His amber eyes locked on a spot where the snow looked disturbed, unnatural, as if something larger lay beneath, waiting to be unearthed. The wind howled through the pine trees, sharp and accusing, and Baxter felt his hands shake not from cold but from a question that crawled up his spine like ice water. What else was buried here in this forgotten corner of the mountains, and why had no one ever told him the truth about where his grandfather fell? Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Baxter knelt beside the German shepherd, his knees pressing into snow that soaked through his jeans, and he turned the badge over in his gloved fingers, tracing the worn edges with a reverence reserved for sacred things. Shadow leaned against him, the dog's muscular body radiating warmth and certainty, a silent promise that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together as they always had. The dog had been his companion for 3 years now, adopted from a shelter after Baxter returned from his final tour, and in that time Shadow had proven himself more than a pet. He was a guardian, a confidant, a brother in arms who understood the language of trauma without needing words. Baxter closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him, the roar of engines at Tuskegee Army Airfield, the sting of segregation even among men who bled the same red, the way white officers refused to meet his eyes even as he flew missions that saved their lives. He had carried that weight for decades, the burden of being exceptional yet invisible, heroic yet unwelcome, and now this badge in his hand threatened to crack open a history he thought he had buried as deep as the snow around him. Shadow's discovery was no accident. For weeks now, the dog had been restless during their morning walks through the forest trails behind Baxter's cabin, veering off the path to sniff at tree roots and dig at patches of earth with an urgency that bordered on obsession. Baxter had dismissed it as prey drive, perhaps a rabbit warren or the lingering scent of elk. But Shadow was trained and disciplined, a rescue dog who had washed out of police work not for lack of skill, but for being too gentle with children during community events. The dog possessed an intelligence that sometimes unnerved Baxter, a way of reading situations and making decisions that seemed almost human. When Shadow refused to leave this particular clearing this morning, circling the same spot over and over while whining deep in his chest, Baxter had finally relented and let him dig. Now, holding evidence of his grandfather's existence in his palm, Baxter understood that Shadow had not been chasing ghosts but uncovering them. The connection between them deepened in that moment, a recognition that they were partners in a mission neither had fully understood until now. Baxter's grandfather had been a Tuskegee Airman, one of the 332nd Fighter Group who flew with a courage that defied the hatred aimed at them from their own countrymen, and if his badge was here in these Colorado mountains instead of over European battlefields, then the story Baxter had been told his entire life was a lie. The decision to follow this thread, to pull at the loose ends of family history and military records, filled Baxter with a dread he recognized from combat. It was the feeling of flying into flak, of knowing the sky ahead was full of metal meant to tear you apart, but pressing forward anyway because the mission demanded it and your brothers depended on you. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold, and looked down at Shadow, who sat at attention, ears pricked forward, waiting for orders. The dog's dark coat blended with the shadows of the pines, but his eyes shone with an alertness that spoke of readiness for whatever came next. Baxter tucked the badge into his jacket pocket, feeling its weight settle against his chest like a second heartbeat, and made a choice that would unravel everything. He would find out what happened to his grandfather, would trace the path that led from Tuskegee's segregated airfield to this frozen clearing, and he would do it with Shadow by his side, because that was how warriors moved through hostile territory, together and watching each other's backs. The wind picked up, scattering snow across their tracks, and somewhere in the distance a branch cracked under the weight of ice, a sound like gunfire that made Baxter's muscles tense with old instincts. The forest felt suddenly less like sanctuary and more like a place where secrets came to die, and he wondered if by digging them up, he was inviting danger into the fragile peace he had built in these mountains. But he was a Tuskegee Airman's grandson, trained in the same skies that had forged legends, and he would not turn away from truth no matter how cold the trail or how deep the snow that tried to bury it. Baxter Lee had spent the better part of 3 decades trying to outrun a history that followed him like a shadow, but you cannot escape the weight of being a black man trained to fly in a country that barely acknowledged your humanity. He had joined the Air Force in the footsteps of the Tuskegee legacy, following his grandfather's path through flight school, where instructors held him to standards twice as high as his white counterparts, where every mistake was magnified and every success diminished as if excellence from a black pilot was somehow less remarkable than mediocrity from a white one. The military had promised equality in the sky, but Baxter learned quickly that altitude did not erase prejudice. It only made it harder to see from the ground. He flew combat missions over hostile territory, his hands steady on controls that vibrated with the thunder of engines, and when he returned to base, he was directed to segregated quarters, forbidden from the officers' club his rank had earned, told with polite smiles and cold eyes that integration was happening but not quite yet. Not for him. After his discharge, Baxter carried that contradiction home like shrapnel lodged too deep to remove without killing the patient, and he found that civilian life offered no relief from the exhaustion of proving his worth to people determined not to see it. The cabin he called home sat at 8,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains, a 2-room structure built from lodgepole pine that creaked in the wind and smelled of wood smoke and solitude. He had bought the land with his military savings, choosing isolation over community because at least the mountains did not judge him for the color of his skin, did not whisper behind his back or cross the street when they saw him coming. Up here, the only voices were the wind through the trees and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead, and Baxter had convinced himself that this was enough, that a man could live on silence and self-sufficiency if he disciplined his mind the way he had disciplined his body in the cockpit. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as a metronome. Wake before dawn, split firewood until his shoulders burned, check the trapline for rabbits, melt snow for water when the pipes froze, read by kerosene lamp until his eyes grew too heavy to focus. It was a hard life, made harder by the altitude and the cold, but hardness was familiar to Baxter, a companion he understood better than comfort. He had learned in the military that survival required vigilance, that letting your guard down even for a moment could get you killed, and though the war was over, and the enemies now were loneliness and cold instead of bullets and flak, the instinct to stay alert never left him. The isolation was both sanctuary and prison, protecting him from the racism that had poisoned every interaction in the valley town below, while also cutting him off from the human connection he privately ached for, but refused to pursue. Shadow had entered his life 3 years ago on a winter morning, when Baxter drove down to the valley for supplies, and past the animal shelter on the edge of town. He had not planned to stop, had no use for a dog or the responsibility it would bring. But something about the German shepherd in the outdoor kennel caught his attention, perhaps the way the animal sat perfectly still despite the cold, watching traffic, with an alertness that reminded Baxter of himself. The shelter volunteer, a young white woman with kind eyes and no apparent discomfort around him, explained that Shadow had been trained for police work but failed certification because he was too gentle with children during community demonstrations, too reluctant to show aggression even in controlled scenarios. The dog was smart, obedient, loyal to a fault, but lacked the edge law enforcement required, and so he had ended up here, unwanted despite his gifts. Because those gifts did not fit the narrow definition of useful the world had decided upon. Baxter recognized something of his own story in that description, the way exceptional qualities could become liabilities if they made uncomfortable people who needed you to be something simpler, something easier to categorize and control. He adopted Shadow that day without fully understanding why, paying the fee and loading the dog into his truck while the volunteer wished them luck with a smile that suggested she knew this was the right match even if Baxter did not yet see it. The drive back up the mountain was quiet, Shadow sitting in the passenger seat with his head out the window, tasting the thin alpine air, and when they reached the cabin the dog followed Baxter inside as if he had always belonged there, curling up by the wood stove like he was coming home rather than entering a strange place for the first time. The bond between them deepened in ways Baxter had not anticipated. Filling spaces in his life, he had tried to convince himself, were not empty. Shadow became more than a companion. He became a translator for emotions Baxter had buried so deep he had forgotten how to name them. On nights when the nightmares came, when Baxter woke, gasping and drenched in sweat from dreams of flames and falling, Shadow was there, pressing his solid body against Baxter's legs, grounding him with warmth and steady breathing, until the panic subsided and reality reasserted itself. The dog seemed to sense when the weight of isolation grew too heavy, when the silence stopped being peaceful and started being oppressive, and on those days, Shadow would bring Baxter his leash, or nudge his hand insistently until they went outside together, walking trails through pine forests where the only sounds were their footsteps in snow and the distant chatter of squirrels. Baxter talked to Shadow in ways he had never talked to another living being, sharing stories about his grandfather, about flight school at Tuskegee, where young black men defied every expectation placed upon them, about missions flown over enemy territory where death was a constant passenger, but so was a fierce pride in proving that courage had no color. Shadow listened with his head tilted, amber eyes locked on Baxter's face, and though the dog could not understand the words, Baxter felt heard in a way that mattered more than comprehension. It was the gift of presence without judgment, attention without agenda, and it cracked open something in Baxter's chest that he had kept sealed shut since leaving the military. He began to realize that Shadow was not just a pet, but a partner, a fellow warrior who had also been discarded by a system that valued certain traits over others, and together they formed their own two-man unit, watching each other's backs the way soldiers do when the world outside the foxhole cannot be trusted. The morning Shadow found the badge, Baxter had been wrestling with a question that had haunted him since childhood. What really happened to his grandfather, the Tuskegee Airman whose plane disappeared in 1944 and whose story became family legend wrapped in silence and pain? The official record said Samuel Lee had gone down over Germany during an escort mission, his P-51 Mustang hit by anti-aircraft fire, his body never recovered and presumed lost in the chaos of war. But there had always been gaps in that story, inconsistencies that gnawed at Baxter whenever he thought about them too long. His grandmother had refused to speak of Samuel's death, growing tight-lipped and distant whenever young Baxter asked questions, and his mother had inherited that same reluctance, as if the truth was too dangerous to share or too painful to revisit. Now, holding his grandfather's badge in his hand, feeling the metal still cold from its burial in Colorado snow, Baxter understood that the story he had been told was incomplete at best and perhaps deliberately false at worst. The badge should not be here, thousands of miles from any European battlefield, buried in mountains that had no connection to the war, except as training grounds for soldiers who never made it overseas. Shadow's discovery was not random, it was revelation, an answer to a question Baxter had carried his entire life, and it demanded action even though every instinct screamed at him to rebury the badge, to walk away, to let the dead rest and the lies stand because truth had a cost he might not be able to pay. But he was his grandfather's heir in more than blood. He carried the same stubborn refusal to accept injustice, the same need to fly toward the truth even when flak filled the sky. And so he made his choice standing there in the snow with Shadow beside him, a choice to follow this thread wherever it led and damn the consequences, because some debts could only be paid by the living, and some stories demanded to be told no matter how long they had been silenced. The town at the base of the mountains was called Pinewood, a name that promised rustic charm but delivered something closer to suspicion wrapped in polite smiles. Baxter drove down the winding dirt road 2 days after Shadow's discovery, the badge tucked in his jacket pocket like a talisman, his truck's engine grinding against the steep descent while Shadow sat in the passenger seat with his head out the window, ears flapping in the cold wind. The town itself was small enough that strangers were noticed immediately, and black strangers were noticed with a particular intensity that Baxter had learned to read like a weather pattern, the way eyes tracked him from storefront windows, the way conversations paused when he walked past, the way cashiers suddenly became extremely interested in counting their registers when he approached the counter. He needed information, needed to find someone who might know about his grandfather's connection to these mountains, and his first stop was the local historical society housed in a cramped room above the post office, where a white-haired woman named Margaret looked at him with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. When Baxter explained what he was looking for, showing her the badge and asking if there were any records of Tuskegee Airmen training in Colorado during the war. Margaret's expression shifted from polite interest to something harder, and she told him in a voice sweet as arsenic that they kept very thorough records, and there was nothing about any colored pilots in their archives. Perhaps he was mistaken about the location. The dismissal stung not because it was unexpected, but because it was so practiced, so smooth, as if Margaret had been refusing to help black people for so long that it had become muscle memory. Baxter thanked her anyway, his grandfather's training in dignity under fire asserting itself, and he walked back to his truck where Shadow waited, the dog's tail wagging at his approach because Shadow did not understand human cruelty, only loyalty. They drove to the diner on Main Street, a place with vinyl booths and checkered floors, and a menu that advertised home cooking in looping script. And when Baxter walked in, every head turned to assess him with the calculation of people deciding whether his presence was a problem worth addressing. He took a seat at the counter, Shadow waiting outside tied to a post, and ordered coffee from a waitress who seemed genuinely friendly until the cook, a heavy-set white man with arms like tree trunks, leaned out of the kitchen and said loud enough for the whole room to hear that they did not serve people who did not respect the dress code, nodding pointedly at Baxter's worn military jacket, as if it was somehow offensive. Baxter knew this game, had played it 100 times in 100 different towns, and he also knew that fighting it only confirmed whatever prejudices these people carried in their hearts like stones. He left $1 on the counter for the coffee he had not drunk, walked out into the cold where Shadow greeted him with uncomplicated joy, and made a decision that crystallized in his chest like ice. He would not beg these people for help, would not subject himself to their racism disguised as civility, but he would find the truth anyway because the mountains did not care about skin color, and neither did his German shepherd, and together they would uncover what had been buried. His sister Lena lived on the eastern edge of Pinewood in a small house with blue shutters and a garden she tended with the same fierce attention she brought to everything in her life. She was 10 years older than Baxter, a retired schoolteacher who had spent 40 years educating other people's children in a district that paid her less than her white colleagues and questioned her competence at every turn. And when Baxter showed her the badge, her face went pale, and she sat down, heavily in her kitchen chair as if her legs had given out. Lena had been a teenager when their grandfather disappeared, old enough to remember him not as myth, but as a living man who had lifted her onto his shoulders and taught her to identify constellations, and she had always harbored her own doubts about the official story of his death. She told Baxter things she had never spoken aloud before, memories she had suppressed because they contradicted the narrative the family had accepted. Their grandmother had received Samuel's death notification not from the military but from a lawyer in Colorado Springs, a man whose name she could not remember but whose letter had arrived 3 months after the official telegram, asking questions about property rights and inheritance that made no sense if Samuel had died overseas. Lena had found that letter years later while cleaning out their grandmother's house after her funeral, but by then their mother was sick, and Lena had convinced herself it was a mistake, a bureaucratic error not worth pursuing because the pain of losing Samuel once was enough without reopening the Prior's wound. Now, holding the badge Baxter had brought her, she understood that the wound had never closed, had only been covered over with lies and time, and she wept for the truth they might have found if they had been braver or less exhausted by the constant battle of being black in America. Lena's grandson Isaac lived with her during the school year while his mother worked 2 jobs in Denver trying to save enough money to buy a house in a neighborhood with better schools and less police harassment. Isaac was 12, bright and curious in the way of children who have not yet learned that asking questions can be dangerous, and he latched onto Baxter's investigation with an enthusiasm that reminded Baxter of himself at that age, before the military had taught him that enthusiasm could get you killed if you showed it in front of people looking for excuses to cut you down. The boy had been studying World War II in school, had done a report on the Tuskegee Airmen that earned him an A, and the resentment of classmates who called him names Lena would not repeat. And when Baxter showed him the badge, Isaac's eyes went wide with the kind of wonder that comes from connecting abstract history to living family. They spread maps across Lena's kitchen table, marking locations where Tuskegee Airmen might have trained or visited Colorado, and Isaac found references Baxter had missed, newspaper articles from 1944 about a special training program in the Rockies that was never officially documented, mentions of Black pilots seen in mountain towns who disappeared before anyone could confirm their presence. The research gave Baxter hope and purpose, but it also drew attention they had not anticipated. The town librarian, a thin white woman with pursed lips, started questioning Isaac about why he was pulling so many old newspaper archives, asking if his grandmother knew what he was doing, suggesting in tones dripping with false concern that maybe he should focus on more appropriate subjects for a boy his age. Isaac came home one afternoon with tears in his eyes, not from sadness but from anger, telling Lena that his teacher had marked down his follow-up report on Tuskegee Airmen in Colorado because she said he was making up stories and spreading misinformation, that if such a program existed there would be official records, and since there were not, he must be lying. The resistance they encountered only confirmed what Baxter had begun to suspect. There was a deliberate effort to suppress the truth about his grandfather's presence in Colorado, a conspiracy not of dramatic secret meetings but of small acts of erasure, the collective decision of people invested in a particular version of history to refuse any evidence that contradicted their narrative. He reached out to Clara Whitmore, the veterinarian who had helped him with Shadow over the years, one of the few white people in Pinewood who had never treated him with suspicion or condescension. Clara was in her 60s, a woman who had lived in these mountains her entire life and knew their secrets the way doctors know anatomy. And when Baxter asked if she had ever heard of Tuskegee Airmen training nearby, she went quiet for a long moment before inviting him into her clinic's back office, where she kept files not related to animals. She pulled out a folder yellowed with age and showed him photographs her father had taken in 1944, images of black pilots standing in front of P-51 Mustangs at a makeshift airfield in a mountain valley, their faces serious and proud, their uniforms marked with the insignia of the 332nd Fighter Group. Clara explained that her father had been a mechanic at that field, had worked on the planes and befriended some of the pilots, and he had told her before he died that there had been a secret training program designed to prepare Tuskegee Airmen for high-altitude missions, but the program had been shut down abruptly after an accident that killed several pilots, and the Army had classified everything, ordering silence from anyone involved and threatening court-martial for those who spoke. Her father had kept the photographs as evidence, as a way of honoring the men whose sacrifice had been erased, and now Clara was giving them to Baxter, because she believed some truths were more important than obedience to authority, and because she was tired of living in a town that preferred comfortable lies to difficult honesty. Henry Walsh was the final piece Baxter needed, an old ranger who lived alone in a cabin even more remote than Baxter's own, a white man who had spent 50 years in these mountains and knew every trail, every valley, every place where the landscape held secrets. Baxter found him through Clara's introduction, driving up a road so rough it barely qualified as a road, and when he explained what he was looking for, Henry nodded slowly and said he had been waiting years for someone from Samuel Lee's family to come asking. Henry had been a young man in 1944, working as a guide for the military program that brought Tuskegee Airmen to train in the high altitude of the Rockies, and he had been there the day Samuel's plane went down, not from enemy fire but from mechanical failure during a training run, the engine seizing in thin air, and the plane spiraling into a mountain valley so remote that recovery was deemed impossible. The military had classified the accident to avoid questions about why black pilots were being trained separately and in dangerous conditions, had told Samuel's family he died overseas to maintain the fiction of integration, and had sworn everyone involved to secrecy with threats that Henry, young and scared of authority, had obeyed for half a century. But he was old now, too old to care about threats from men long dead, and he told Baxter the truth with tears running down his weathered face, apologizing for his silence, for his cowardice, for being part of a system that valued white comfort over black dignity. He offered to take Baxter to the crash site, a place he had visited only once since that day in 1944, because the guilt was too heavy to bear more often, and Baxter accepted, knowing that this journey into the mountains with Shadow and Henry would finally give his grandfather the acknowledgement he deserved, would prove that Samuel Lee had not died in obscure tragedy, but in service to a country that refused to honor him, and that truth, however painful, was worth pursuing to the very edge of the world. The expedition into the mountains began on a morning when the sky hung low and gray, pregnant with snow that Henry Walsh said would arrive by afternoon and turn the high passes treacherous. They gathered at Baxter's cabin before dawn, Baxter and Shadow, Henry, with his weathered pack and decades of mountain knowledge, and against all his better judgment, young Isaac, who had begged so persistently that Lena finally relented on the condition that he stay close and turn back at the first sign of real danger. Baxter had tried to argue against bringing the boy, knowing that what they might find at the crash site would be no sight for a 12-year-old, but Isaac had looked him in the eye and said something that silenced all objections, that Samuel Lee was his blood too, his great-great-grandfather, and he had a right to honor that connection, even if it meant facing hard truths. So they set out as a party of 4, 3 humans and 1 German shepherd, climbing trails that grew steeper and narrower as they left the tree line behind and entered the realm of exposed rock and wind that cut like razors. Shadow ranged ahead, his instincts for navigation proving as reliable as Henry's maps, and when the old ranger paused to catch his breath and check their bearings, the dog would circle back to ensure the group stayed together, his protective nature asserting itself in ways that made Baxter grateful, once again, for the bond they shared. They had been hiking for 3 hours when they encountered Silas Ingram, though at first Baxter did not recognize the danger the man represented. Silas appeared on the trail ahead of them, as if materialized from the mist, a white man in his 50s with the kind of outdoors gear that screamed money and the kind of expression that screamed entitlement. He introduced himself as a land developer with interests in the valley, said he was surveying the area for a potential resort project, and asked with a smile that never reached his eyes what brought them so far into the backcountry on a day when weather was turning. Henry, who knew these mountains, and the people who tried to exploit them, stiffened beside Baxter, and Shadow released a low growl that rumbled from deep in his chest, a warning Baxter had learned to trust without question. When Baxter explained they were looking for a historical site, Silas's expression shifted into something colder, and he mentioned almost casually that he owned much of the land in this area, had inherited it from his father, who had worked for the government during the war, and that he did not appreciate trespassers stirring up old business that was better left buried. The threat was delivered with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to using his race and his resources to make problems disappear, and Baxter felt Isaac move closer to him, the boy's instinct recognizing danger even if he could not articulate its source. They pushed past Silas with terse words and mounting tension, but Baxter knew this was not over, that they had triggered something in the developer that would not resolve peacefully. The crash site sat in a narrow valley surrounded by peaks that scraped the clouds, a place so remote that Baxter understood immediately why the military had never attempted recovery. The wreckage of the P-51 Mustang was scattered across the rocky slope, pieces of fuselage and wing half buried in soil that had accumulated over decades, and when Baxter saw the tail section with its faded red marking, the distinctive paint of the Tuskegee Airman's 332nd Fighter Group, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. This was real, not a story or a legend, but twisted metal that had once carried his grandfather through the sky, and the weight of that reality crushed down on Baxter's chest until he could barely breathe the thin mountain air. Shadow approached the wreckage cautiously, sniffing at the debris, and then began digging at a spot near what remained of the cockpit, his paws working with the same focused intensity he had shown when he found the badge. Henry knelt beside the dog and began clearing earth with his hands, and within minutes they uncovered a leather flight jacket, preserved by the cold and the altitude, with Samuel Lee's name stenciled on the chest and a diary tucked into the inside pocket. Baxter lifted the jacket with trembling hands, feeling the weight of his grandfather's last moments, and when he opened the diary, the pages revealed a story that made his blood run cold. Samuel had been flying a test mission for experimental high-altitude equipment, had reported mechanical problems over the radio, and had been told by his commanding officer to continue the flight, because abandoning the mission would waste resources the Army could not afford to lose on a colored pilot who was, in the officer's words, expendable. Isaac read the diary entry over Baxter's shoulder and made a sound like he had been punched, a sharp intake of breath that carried all the horror of understanding how little Samuel's life had mattered to the people who sent him into the sky. Henry bowed his head in shame, explaining that he had not known the full extent of the negligence, had been told the crash was simply an accident, but now, seeing the evidence of deliberate disregard for safety, he understood that Samuel Lee had been murdered not by enemy fire but by the racism that deemed black lives acceptable casualties in the pursuit of military advancement. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, choking and inescapable, and Baxter felt something crack inside him, a fury so pure and so long suppressed that it threatened to consume everything else. But before he could process the emotion, before he could decide what to do with this evidence of institutional murder, Shadow's ears pricked forward, and the dog released a warning bark that echoed across the valley. Silas Ingram emerged from the rocks above them, no longer alone but accompanied by 2 other men, and in his hand he carried a pistol that he aimed casually in their direction. He explained in a voice devoid of pretense that his father had been the commanding officer who ordered Samuel to fly despite the mechanical issues, had covered up the negligence by classifying the mission and threatening anyone who asked questions, and that Silas had spent his life benefiting from property and patents stolen from the Tuskegee program, technology his father claimed as his own invention by erasing the black engineers who developed it. The diary was evidence that could destroy Silas's entire legacy, could expose his family's theft and his father's role in Samuel's death, and he would not allow it to leave this mountain. The confrontation escalated with terrifying speed. Silas demanded they hand over the diary and the flight jacket, promised that if they complied he would let them walk away. But the lie was transparent in his eyes, and Baxter knew that men like Silas did not leave witnesses when their entire fortune hung in the balance. Henry stepped forward, trying to reason with Silas by appealing to their shared history in these mountains, but one of Silas's companions, a younger man with dead eyes and twitchy hands, swung a rifle toward Henry and told him to shut up, or he would make him shut up. Isaac grabbed Baxter's arm, fear radiating from the boy in waves, and Baxter made a calculation he had learned in combat. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had terrain and they had shadow, and if they could create enough chaos, they might escape into the mountains where Silas's money and weapons would not help him navigate the wilderness. Baxter gave Shadow the signal they had practiced, the silent hand gesture that meant protect and attack, and the German Shepherd exploded into motion with a speed and ferocity that caught Silas's men completely off guard. Shadow hit the man with the rifle at a dead run, 100 pounds of muscle and tooth and loyalty slamming into the gunman's chest and driving him backward into the rocks where his head connected with stone and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Chaos erupted across the crash site. Silas fired his pistol, the shot echoing like thunder, but Shadow was already moving, and the bullet sparked off rock where the dog had been a heartbeat before. Baxter grabbed Isaac and pushed him toward Henry, shouting at the old ranger to get the boy out of the valley, and Henry did not hesitate, pulling Isaac away even as the boy screamed Baxter's name. The second gunman tried to track Shadow's movement, but the dog was too fast, weaving between wreckage and using the terrain like a trained soldier. And when the man turned his attention to Baxter, thinking the human was easier prey, Shadow launched himself from atop a piece of fuselage and clamped his jaws around the gunman's wrist, forcing him to drop his weapon while screaming in pain. Silas advanced on Baxter, the pistol steady in his hand, and he spoke with the calm certainty of a man who believed his superiority was ordained by birth, that Baxter and his grandfather and every black pilot who flew in the war were lucky to have been allowed to serve, that they should be grateful for the opportunity rather than digging up complaints about how they were treated, and that if Samuel had been a better pilot he would not have died in these mountains like he deserved. The words were gasoline on the fire of Baxter's rage, and when Silas pulled the trigger, Baxter was already moving, using the combat training that had never left his muscles, closing the distance and driving his shoulder into Silas's midsection before the bullet could find its mark. They grappled on the rocky ground, 2 men fighting over more than a diary or a legacy but over the fundamental question of whose life mattered and who had the right to erase history when it became inconvenient. Silas was stronger than his age suggested, fueled by desperation and the primal need to protect the lies he had built his life upon. But Baxter had been forged in combat that Silas could not imagine, had survived not just war but the daily battle of being black in America, and that survival had made him harder than any man whose biggest struggle was maintaining inherited wealth. They rolled across the wreckage, Silas trying to bring the pistol to bear, Baxter fighting to control the weapon, and in the background Shadow continued his assault on the second gunman, the dog's training and natural protective instinct combining to create a force that would not stop until the prover threat was neutralized or Shadow was dead. The first snowflakes began to fall, the storm Henry had predicted arriving early, and within minutes the visibility dropped to almost nothing as wind-driven snow turned the valley into a whiteout. Silas took advantage of the chaos to break free from Baxter's grip and scrambled up the rocky slope, shouting for his men to fall back, and the surviving gunman stumbled after him, bleeding from multiple wounds, where Shadow had torn clothing and flesh in his determination to protect his human. Baxter struggled to his feet, searching for Isaac and Henry in the blinding snow, and relief flooded through him when he heard Henry's voice calling from below, saying they were safe. They had found cover in a rock overhang. But the relief was short-lived, because Shadow did not return when Baxter called him, and panic replaced every other emotion as Baxter realized the dog was pursuing Silas up the mountain, driven by an instinct to eliminate the threat completely. Baxter climbed after them, his hands numb from cold and his breath coming in ragged gasps, and he found Shadow at the edge of a cliff face where Silas had cornered himself in his panic to escape. The dog stood between Baxter and Silas, hackles raised and teeth bared, and Baxter saw in that moment that Shadow was not just protecting him but making a choice about justice, about whether to let this man fall to his death or to show mercy he had not earned. Silas begged, all his arrogance stripped away by the proximity of mortality, and he made promises he would never keep, offered money and influence and anything Baxter wanted if he would just call off the dog. Baxter looked at Silas and saw not just one man but a whole system of oppression. Every commanding officer who had sent black pilots on suicide missions, every clerk who had lost paperwork and denied benefits, every citizen who had benefited from black sacrifice while denying black humanity. And he wanted in that moment to let Shadow do what came naturally, to let justice be served by gravity and snow. But then Isaac's voice reached him from below, the boy shouting through the storm that they had the diary and the jacket, that they had the evidence they needed, and something in that young voice reminded Baxter of what his grandfather had fought for. Samuel Lee had not flown missions over enemy territory so his grandson could become a murderer in the mountains, had not endured segregation and disrespect, so the legacy of Tuskegee Airmen could be reduced to revenge. Baxter called Shadow back, the command cutting through the wind, and the German shepherd obeyed instantly because their bond was built on trust that ran deeper than any single moment of rage. They left Silas shivering on the cliff edge and descended through the storm to where Henry and Isaac waited, and together the four of them began the dangerous journey back down the mountain while snow erased their tracks and turned the world into a wall of white that threatened to swallow them whole. Shadow led the way, his instincts for navigation intact even when visibility dropped to zero, and Baxter followed the dog with absolute faith, understanding that sometimes the truest form of heroism was not violence, but the courage to choose mercy when the world would forgive you for choosing otherwise. The descent became a nightmare of ice and wind and exhaustion. Henry, despite his decades of mountain experience, struggled with the pace and the altitude, and twice Baxter had to steady the old ranger when his legs threatened to give out. Isaac stayed close, his young body handling the physical demands better than the adults. But his face showed the trauma of what he had witnessed, the violence and hatred that had been abstract history, made terrifyingly real. They were an hour from the tree line when the avalanche hit, not a massive slide, but enough to sweep away the trail they were following, and send them tumbling down a steep embankment into a ravine they had not seen in the whiteout. Baxter felt his ribs crack as he slammed into a boulder, pain exploding through his chest. And when he tried to call out for Isaac and Henry, his voice was lost in the roar of shifting snow and rock. He dug himself out of the debris with hands that no longer felt connected to his body, and the first thing he saw was Shadow standing over Isaac, the dog having somehow positioned himself to shield the boy from the worst of the slide. Isaac was conscious but pinned under a fallen log, and Henry was nowhere to be seen, buried somewhere in the tons of snow that had transformed the landscape in seconds. Baxter and Shadow worked together to free Isaac, the man using his remaining strength to lever the log, while the dog dug frantically at the snow around the boy's legs. When Isaac finally pulled free, he was sobbing with pain and fear. His left leg bent at an angle that made Baxter's stomach turn, and the boy kept asking where Henry was. Why wasn't Henry helping them? Baxter told him to stay put, and began searching for the ranger, calling Henry's name into the storm while Shadow ranged back and forth across the debris field, nose working desperately to find the scent of the man who had guided them into these mountains. It was Shadow who found him, barking urgently from a spot 20 yards downslope where a gloved hand protruded from the snow like a grave marker. Baxter dug with his bare hands, his broken ribs screaming with every movement, and when they finally uncovered Henry's face, the old man was blue-lipped and barely breathing, his eyes unfocused and his body limp from cold and trauma. They could not carry him, could barely move themselves, and the storm showed no signs of letting up, and Baxter understood with terrible clarity that they were going to die in this ravine unless they found shelter and found it fast. Shadow solved the problem the way he had solved every problem since entering Baxter's life, with intelligence and initiative that bordered on uncanny. The dog disappeared into the whiteout for minutes that felt like hours, and when he returned he barked insistently and tugged at Baxter's jacket, pulling him in a direction that seemed to lead deeper into the ravine rather than out of it. Baxter trusted the dog completely at this point, had no other choice, and he managed to get Isaac onto his back while dragging Henry by his jacket collar, following Shadow through the storm until the dog led them to a narrow cave opening hidden behind a rockfall. The cave was shallow but dry, protected from the wind, and there was evidence that animals had used it as a den, which meant it was insulated and stable. Baxter got Henry and Isaac inside, and then collapsed beside them, his body finally giving out, and Shadow curled up against all three humans, sharing his body heat in the primitive mathematics of survival. They had the diary and the flight jacket, had the evidence of Samuel Lee's murder and Silas Ingram's complicity, but in that moment, none of it mattered compared to the simple question of whether they would live to see morning. The night in the cave was the longest of Baxter's life, every minute stretching into an eternity of cold and pain and the certainty that they would not survive to see dawn. Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and labored, and Isaac whimpered occasionally from the pain of his broken leg but mostly stayed quiet with the kind of forced bravery that broke Baxter's heart because no child should have to be that strong. Shadow remained pressed against all three of them, the dog's body heat and steady presence the only thing keeping hypothermia at bay, and Baxter spent those dark hours thinking about his grandfather, about Samuel Lee, who had died in these same mountains because people decided his life was worth less than the convenience of continuing a dangerous mission. He thought about the 332nd Fighter Group, about the Redtails who had flown 1,500 missions and never lost a bomber to enemy fighters, who had proven their excellence beyond any shadow of doubt, and still came home to a country that refused them service at restaurants and denied them jobs and housing because their skin color mattered more than their heroism. The injustice of it burned in Baxter's chest hotter than his broken ribs, but alongside that anger was something else, something that felt like resolution, or maybe redemption. He had found the truth about his grandfather, had recovered evidence that would finally give Samuel the recognition he deserved, and if Baxter died in this cave tonight, at least he would die knowing he had honored his bloodline and refused to let lies stand unchallenged. But Shadow had other plans, because German shepherds do not accept death quietly when their pack is threatened. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cave entrance, the storm finally breaking after 18 hours of relentless snow, the dog stood and shook himself, and then walked to the cave mouth and released a series of barks that echoed across the mountain valley with a volume and urgency that could only be described as a distress call. Baxter tried to call him back, afraid the noise would trigger another avalanche or alert Silas to their location. But Shadow ignored him and continued barking in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, 3 short barks followed by 3 long ones, repeated over and over until Baxter realized with astonishment that the dog was mimicking an SOS signal. Where Shadow had learned this pattern, Baxter could not guess, perhaps from his police training or perhaps from some deeper instinct that transcended training, but the effect was immediate. Within an hour they heard voices calling through the clear morning air, and Clara Whitmore appeared at the cave entrance with 2 park rangers and a rescue team that included medics and climbing equipment and faces full of relief when they saw that everyone was still alive. Clara explained that Lena had called her when they did not return by nightfall, that she had contacted search and rescue despite the storm, and that when the weather cleared, they had begun combing the mountain using Henry's planned route as a guide. Finding them had seemed impossible given the avalanche that obscured the trail, but Shadow's barking had carried across the valley and led the rescuers directly to the cave, and Clara looked at the German shepherd with something like awe when she realized what he had done. The rescue took hours, carefully extracting Isaac and Henry from the cave and stabilizing them for transport down the mountain on litters. Baxter refused treatment until they were all safely below the tree line, his broken ribs grinding with every step, but his focus entirely on ensuring the boy and the old ranger survived this ordeal he had led them into. They reached the trailhead by noon, where ambulances waited to take Henry and Isaac to the hospital in the valley, and Lena was there sobbing with relief when she saw her grandson alive, wrapping him in blankets and whispering prayers of gratitude. Clara took charge of Samuel's diary and flight jacket, promising to deliver them to the proper authorities, and she told Baxter that she had already contacted a lawyer who specialized in military records and civil rights cases, someone who could use this evidence to not only clear Samuel's name but potentially expose the broader pattern of negligence and racism that had killed him. The rescue team also reported that they had found Silas Ingram and his companions on the far side of the mountain, alive but suffering from severe exposure, and that Silas had been arrested on charges of assault and attempted murder once the Rangers heard the full story of what had happened at the Reclay crash site. Justice, it seemed, moved slowly, but it moved, and Baxter allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in years, hope that the truth might actually matter. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital visits and legal consultations and media attention that Baxter found both validating and exhausting. Henry recovered from his injuries, though doctors said he would never regain full lung capacity, the altitude and the trauma having taken a permanent toll, but he seemed lighter somehow, as if confessing his role in the cover-up and helping expose the truth had lifted a weight he had carried for 50 years. Isaac's leg healed with the resilience of youth, and the boy became something of a local hero at school, the same classmates who had mocked his research on Tuskegee Airmen, now eager to hear about his adventure in the mountains and his role in uncovering hidden history. The diary and flight jacket were authenticated by military historians, and the story they told sparked a federal investigation into the classified training program that had killed Samuel Lee and at least 6 other Tuskegee Airmen, whose deaths had been similarly covered up and misreported. Silas Ingram, facing overwhelming evidence and public outrage, accepted a plea deal that required him to forfeit the patents and property his family had stolen, to fund a memorial for the pilots who died in the Colorado program, and to spend 5 years in prison for his attack on Baxter's group. It was not enough, could never be enough to balance the scales of 70 years of lies and stolen legacy, but it was more than Baxter had dared to hope for when Shadow first dug up that badge in the snow. The ceremony to honor Samuel Lee and the other fallen pilots of the secret Colorado program took place on a clear September morning at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, and Baxter stood at attention in his dress uniform beside a memorial plaque that bore his grandfather's name and the names of his 6 brothers who died in those mountains. Shadow sat beside him, wearing a ceremonial vest that identified him as a service dog, and when the 3-volley salute cracked across the parade ground, the German shepherd did not flinch, but remained perfectly still, as if he understood the solemnity of the moment. The Air Force Chief of Staff personally apologized for the negligence and racism that had killed these men, and for the decades of silence that had denied their families closure, and he announced that Samuel Lee was being posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service. Sacrifice. Lena wept as she accepted the medal, and Isaac stood beside her with his hand over his heart, and Baxter felt the presence of his grandfather so strongly it was as if Samuel was standing there with them, finally receiving the honor he had earned with his courage and paid for with his life. The ceremony concluded with a flyover of 4 F-16 seconds in missing man formation, and as the lead aircraft pulled up and away, leaving a gap in the formation that symbolized the fallen, Baxter looked down at Shadow and thought about loyalty and sacrifice, and the ways that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied, how sometimes the truth waits generations to emerge but emerges nonetheless because someone refuses to stop digging. In the months after the ceremony, Baxter's life shifted in ways both subtle and profound. He was still the same man, still carried the same scars from combat and from being black in America, but the isolation that had defined his existence in the mountains felt less necessary now, less like sanctuary, and more like self-imposed exile. He began making regular trips down to Pinewood, not because the town had changed its character but because he had changed his relationship to it, no longer willing to let other people's prejudice determine where he could go or what he could do. He volunteered at the school where Isaac attended, talking to students about military history and the Tuskegee Airmen. And he was surprised by how many young people were genuinely interested, how hungry they were for stories that complicated the simple narratives they had been taught about war and race and heroism. Clara introduced him to other veterans in the area, men and women who had served in different eras and different branches but who understood the particular wounds that come from serving a country that does not always serve you back. And Baxter found himself part of a community he had not known he needed. Shadow remained his constant companion through all of it, the dog's presence a reminder that loyalty transcends species, and that the most profound bonds are often formed not through words but through shared trials, and the simple act of showing up for each other when the world turns dangerous. The final piece of healing came when Baxter decided to write a book about his grandfather's story. Working with a historian, Clara had recommended to piece together the full narrative of the Colorado training program and the systemic racism that had shaped its operations and its cover-up. The research took him deep into military archives and personal testimonies, and he discovered that Samuel had written letters to his wife, Baxter's grandmother, that she had kept hidden in a trunk in the attic because they contained his complaints about the dangerous conditions and the disregard his white commanding officers showed for black pilots' safety. Those letters, combined with the diary and the flight jacket and the testimony of men like Henry Walsh, who had witnessed the negligence firsthand, painted a picture of institutional murder dressed up as military necessity. And the book, when it was published, became both a memorial to the dead and an indictment of the system that killed them. Baxter dedicated the book to Shadow, writing in the foreword that without his German Shepherd's persistence and courage, none of the truth would have come to light. That sometimes the most profound act of witness comes not from humans who can speak but from animals who refuse to let injustice remain buried. The book found an audience far beyond what Baxter expected, winning awards and being adopted into military academy curricula, and in the acknowledgments section he quoted something his grandfather had written in one of those hidden letters, a line that became the moral center of everything that followed. In the darkness of prejudice, loyalty to truth is the only light bright enough to illuminate the path to dignity and reunion. 1 year to the day after Shadow found the badge, Baxter returned to the crash site with Lena and Isaac and Clara and Henry, carrying with them a bronze marker to place at the spot where Samuel Lee's P-51 had gone down. The hike was easier this time, taken in summer warmth rather than winter storm, and when they reached the valley they found that wildflowers had grown up around the wreckage, nature reclaiming what war had destroyed. They mounted the marker on a boulder overlooking the debris field, and Baxter read aloud from his grandfather's diary, the entries that spoke of his love for flying and his frustration with being treated as less than human by the very institution he served with such distinction. When the reading was done, they stood in silence, each person alone with their thoughts, and then Isaac asked if he could say something and Baxter nodded. The boy spoke in a voice steady beyond his years, thanking Samuel Lee for his sacrifice and promising that his generation would do better, would build a country where skin color did not determine worth, and where heroes were honored regardless of the prejudices of their time. It was the kind of idealism that Baxter had lost decades ago, worn away by experience and disappointment, but hearing it from Isaac he felt something crack open in his chest, a possibility he had not allowed himself to consider. That maybe the struggle was worth it, that maybe each generation's small acts of courage and truth-telling accumulated into something larger, something that could actually bend the arc of history toward justice, even if the bending was slow and incomplete, and required sacrifice from people who would never live to see the final result. They spent the afternoon at the crash site, sharing stories and taking photographs, and when it was time to leave, Baxter lingered for a moment alone with Shadow. The German Shepherd sat beside him, alert and calm, and Baxter put his hand on the dog's head and spoke aloud the words he had never quite managed to say to another living being. That Shadow had saved his life not once but many times over, not just in the mountains during the storm but in the years before, by refusing to let him disappear into isolation and bitterness, by demanding connection and purpose, and the kind of loyalty that makes survival worth the effort. Shadow looked up at him with amber eyes that seemed to hold understanding beyond language, and Baxter realized that this was what his grandfather had meant about loyalty illuminating the path to dignity and reunion. The loyalty was not just what Baxter owed to Samuel's memory or what Shadow showed to Baxter, but something larger, a commitment to truth and justice, and the hard work of making the world slightly less cruel for those who came after. It was the kind of loyalty that required action, not just sentiment, that demanded you keep digging even when the ground was frozen and the truth was buried deep. And it was the kind of loyalty that, once given, could not be taken back or compromised without losing some essential part of yourself. Baxter stood and whistled for Shadow, and together they walked back down the mountain toward the life they had built together, toward the community that had grown around their shared courage, toward whatever came next, knowing that they would face it the way warriors always had, side by side, watching each other's backs, refusing to let the darkness win. If you have a story about loyalty that changed your life, share it in the comments below so we can honor the bonds that make us stronger together. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable connections between veterans and their faithful companions. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to continue this journey with us and discover another tale of heroism that history tried to forget. Drop a comment, 332 for the fighter group that proved excellence has no color, and for Shadow, whose loyalty unearthed a truth that had been buried for 70 years, bringing honor home to a hero who never stopped flying.